China has just made a strategic move that will transform how the global economy operates for many years to come. If you are not closely monitoring what is happening right now, you may find yourself asking how everything changed so drastically without anyone explaining it to you. This decision is one that leaders in the United States have been concerned about for quite some time. Experts in Washington have anticipated this for years, and now China has finally acted. It has sold off United States Treasury bonds in significant amounts. I realize this may sound like dry fiscal jargon to many of you, something that seems to only concern investment professionals on Wall Street or government officials at the Treasury, but let me clarify this for you. What just occurred is far more impactful than any recent election, political declaration, or news event you have encountered in the past few months. This represents a foundational shift in the structure of global economic power. The implications will affect your life, your job, your savings, and your future, regardless of whether you choose to pay attention to it or not. Let me explain precisely what this means and why you should be attentive. For over 50 years, since Richard Nixon abandoned the gold standard in 1971, the United States has operated under an arrangement that I, along with many other skeptical economists, have referred to as the extraordinary privilege of the dollar. This situation is not equitable, nor is it solely based on hard work. Rather, it is a system that relies on an inherent advantage that allows the United States to spend significantly more than it earns, while much of the rest of the world picks up the bill. Here is how it works. The United States generates dollars. These dollars are accepted globally as the reserve currency, meaning that every country needs dollars to conduct business with one another, purchase oil, accumulate savings, and protect themselves during difficult times. Because the world demands dollars, the United States can issue this currency without facing immediate and visible repercussions. It is akin to having a cash printing machine in your home while all of your neighbors agree to accept that cash as legitimate payment. Regardless of how much you print or how irresponsible you are with your finances, you can always generate more money, and someone will accept it because everyone depends on that arrangement. Now, envision this scenario. One day, your largest neighbor, the one running the most lucrative operation in the vicinity, the one who has been accepting your printed cash for years, suddenly declares, "You know what? I no longer want your cash. I will rely on something else. I will depend on gold. I will use my own currency. I will conduct business directly with other neighbors without involving you." That is essentially what China has just done. The ramifications are indeed significant. However, to fully understand why this is so important, we need to examine more closely how this arrangement operates and why it cannot persist indefinitely. I have dedicated my career to studying capitalism, its failures, and its inherent issues. I can tell you that the current arrangement of the dollar as the global reserve currency represents one of the greatest economic disparities in recent memory. It permits the United States, a country that constitutes less than 5% of the global population, to utilize nearly 25% of the world's resources. How is this possible? The United States can cover substantial trade deficits year after year, decade after decade, simply by printing more dollars or issuing more dollar-denominated debt that other nations buy. Consider it this way. If you and I spent more than we earned each month, eventually our credit cards would reach their limits. Banks would deny us further loans, and we would encounter serious financial difficulties. However, the United States has been spending beyond its means for over 40 consecutive years, accumulating enormous trade deficits. Instead of facing immediate consequences, the rest of the world has continued to finance this lifestyle by purchasing United States Treasury bonds. China has traditionally been the largest foreign buyer of these bonds. At its peak, China owned more than $1,300 billion in United States Treasury securities. To provide some context, that amount exceeds the entire economic output of countries such as Mexico or Indonesia. In reality, China has been lending vast sums of money to the United States. The United States has been using that borrowed money to fund its extensive military operations, support endeavors in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, provide tax breaks for affluent individuals, and assist major corporations. Thus, the pertinent question arises, why would China engage in this? Why would it financially support its primary global competitor? Many standard explanations fall short here. They will tell you it was a mutually beneficial relationship where both parties gained. The United States received affordable financing for its deficits, while China gained access to a vast market for its goods. Chinese workers produced items that American consumers purchased with borrowed money, and that money returned to China as dollars that the Chinese government invested in treasury bonds, a supposedly advantageous cycle, they claim. However, that reasoning overlooks a crucial power imbalance. China did not have many genuine alternatives. When a country runs substantial trade surpluses with the United States, it accumulates dollars, and those dollars must be allocated somewhere. You cannot simply allow them to sit idle. You have to invest them. For many years, The most significant, accessible, and seemingly secure option was United States Treasury bonds. It was the only market large enough to accommodate the vast flows of dollars that China was producing. However, there was a significant flaw in this system that China began to recognize more clearly over time. By keeping so much of its wealth in United States Treasury bonds, China was putting itself at the mercy of American financial control. If Washington decided to freeze those assets, China could lose access to over $1 trillion of its national savings. If Washington opted to issue large quantities of new dollars through loose monetary policies, the actual value of China's holdings would diminish. If Washington chose to weaponize the financial system for political ends, as it has repeatedly done with nations such as Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and Afghanistan, China would find itself vulnerable. Here is the key point I want you to consider. China closely observed what the United States did to Russia after the conflict erupted in Ukraine in 2022. Washington froze approximately $30 billion in Russian central bank assets. Let me repeat that. The United States and its allies effectively took control of $300 billion in the foreign reserves of another nation. Regardless of your opinions on Russia or the situation in Ukraine, this marked a pivotal moment in global financial history. It unequivocally demonstrated that dollar-denominated assets, even central bank reserves that are intended to be safeguarded within the global financial framework, can be frozen, withheld, and utilized as a tool for pressure if a nation acts against the interests of the United States. Now, picture yourself in the position of decision-makers in Beijing. You hold $800 billion, previously over $1 trillion, in United States Treasury bonds. You are aware that the United States regards you as its primary strategic adversary. The Pentagon has explicitly identified China as its foremost concern. The United States is forming military alliances in Asia with the specific goal of containing China's influence. It is imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, blocking technology exports to China, and consistently discussing the defense of Taiwan with military support. At the same time, you have $1 trillion of your national savings in holdings that this same country can freeze with a simple directive. What would you do? The answer is evident. You would minimize your exposure, diversify your holdings, and explore alternatives. That is precisely what China has been doing, not hastily, not chaotically, but in a systematic, deliberate, and purposeful manner. Information from the United States Treasury Department reveals this pattern very clearly. China has been gradually selling off United States Treasury bonds for years. From a peak of over $1.3 trillion, it now holds less than $800 billion. That constitutes a reduction of over $500 billion. $500 billion that is no longer supporting the United States' budget deficit. $500 billion that China has reallocated into different assets, various investments, and alternative means of preserving value. Furthermore, China is not alone in this. Japan, historically the second largest owner of United States treasuries, is also reducing its holdings. Saudi Arabia, the country that agreed to the oil for dollars arrangement with the United States in the 1970s, is diversifying its savings and is contemplating selling oil in yuan. Central banks around the globe are acquiring gold at levels not seen in many years. Russia has liquidated nearly all of its United States Treasury bond holdings. India is accumulating gold. Brazil is forming trade agreements in local currencies. The entire system that maintained the dollar at the center of global trade is gradually weakening, and most people are unaware of this because major news outlets are too. The entire system that maintained the dollar at the center of global trade is gradually weakening, and most people are unaware of this because major news outlets are too preoccupied with reporting what some official tweeted or the latest celebrity gossip. Now, let me address the early arguments from proponents of the current system. They will assert, Daniel, this is inconsequential. The United States will always find buyers for its bonds. The dollar is too significant to lose its position. There is no real alternative. China would harm itself if it sold all its bonds because it would decrease the value of its own holdings. On the surface, these arguments may appear reasonable, but they crumble upon even basic scrutiny. First, the claim that there is no substitute for the dollar was true 20 years ago, but it no longer holds today. China has systematically developed alternatives to the dollar-dominated system. It has established CIPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system, which is essentially its own version of the SWIFT system. SWIFT is the network that facilitates global money transfers, and the United States wields significant influence over it, using it as a means to impose sanctions on other nations. With CIPS, China can transfer money globally without relying on networks that Washington can directly monitor or control. Additionally, China has been actively promoting the use of its currency in international trade. It has established currency exchange agreements with numerous countries. It is opening yuan processing centers in major cities around the world. It is pricing more and more of its international trade in yuan, rather than in dollars. Perhaps most importantly, it is underpinning all of this with gold. China has been one of the leading buyers of gold globally for years. It does not disclose exact figures, and this is intentional for strategic reasons, but all estimates suggest it has amassed thousands of tons of gold. Why gold? Because gold possesses qualities that United States Treasury bonds lack. It cannot be frozen, it cannot be penalized, it cannot be produced at will. It represents genuine physical wealth that exists independently of any government's decisions. If tomorrow the United States were to freeze all of China's dollar assets, that gold would still retain its value. It serves as the ultimate safeguard against United States financial dominance. Secondly, the notion that China would inflict harm on itself by selling its bonds conflates short-term actions with long-term strategy. Indeed, if China were to sell all its bonds at once, prices would plummet, and the value of its own holdings would diminish. It would be akin to trying to sell 100,000 shares of a company simultaneously. You would flood the market, and the price would collapse. However, that is not the approach China is taking. It is divesting gradually and consistently over many years. It is reducing its risk without alarming the market. This is akin to the difference between panicking and rushing out of a burning building and calmly exiting in an organized fashion. Both result in leaving, but one is far less damaging. Here is the deeper truth that many supporters of the dollar would prefer to overlook. China can afford to accept some losses on its treasury holdings if it means avoiding a much larger strategic pitfall. Consider it this way. If you have $1 million invested in something you believe will ultimately lose value, would you prefer to sell now for $800,000 or wait and risk losing even more in the future? China is making a strategic decision that it is wiser to incur managed losses now rather than remain entirely exposed in the future. However, the most pressing issue for the United States is not simply that China is selling bonds. The real issue is that the United States requires buyers more than ever. Look at the recent budget deficits in the United States. They are staggering, trillions of dollars each year. Interest payments on the existing national debt alone exceed $600 billion annually. This figure continues to rise as interest rates increase. The United States is caught in a debt cycle. It must borrow more each year just to manage the interest on its existing obligations, in addition to funding regular governmental operations. If the usual foreign buyers, such as China, Japan, and oil-exporting nations, are curtailing their purchases, someone else must fill that gap. So, who buys the bonds when foreign investors withdraw? The Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. When a central bank buys government debt, there is a technical term for that. It is called debt monetization. In simple terms, it means the government is essentially creating money to finance itself. This is precisely what we witnessed during the pandemic. This occurred at an unprecedented scale. The Federal Reserve purchased trillions of dollars in treasury bonds, increasing its balance sheet from under $4 trillion before the pandemic to over $9 trillion at its peak. That is more than $5 trillion generated from nothing and utilized to buy government debt. What was the outcome of this? The worst inflation in 40 years. Food prices surged by 20, 30, even 40%. Fuel prices skyrocketed, rent costs increased, actual wages fell as pay raises could not keep pace with rising expenses. Working families suffered while asset holders, those with stocks and property, became wealthier because all that money generation inflated asset values. This phenomenon is what I refer to as the class impact of monetary policy. When the Federal Reserve generates money, it does not affect everyone equally. It disproportionately benefits individuals who possess financial assets, while adversely affecting those who rely on salaries and whose savings lose purchasing power. So, when people ask me why this is significant and why you should be concerned about China selling treasury bonds, here is the answer. It creates an unsolvable numerical dilemma for the United States. The United States government must either drastically cut spending, which is politically unrealistic, or the Federal Reserve continues to generate money to buy debt that no one else desires. This results in higher inflation, which means your money buys less, leading to a decline in your standard of living. There is no straightforward way out of this contradiction. It is the inevitable result of many years of overspending, funding foreign conflicts with debt, lowering taxes for wealthy individuals while increasing military expenditures, and rescuing banks and large corporations while allowing public infrastructure to deteriorate. This represents the long-term cost of decisions that are now coming into sharp focus. Let me be candid about another aspect. This is not merely a matter of numbers on a page. This is about power. The dollar-based system has been the bedrock of United States global influence for over 50 years. It has allowed the United States to maintain hundreds of military bases abroad. It has enabled the United States to impose financial restrictions on nations it disagrees with by excluding them from the global financial system. It has allowed the United States to sustain a military budget that exceeds the combined budgets of the next 10 nations. All of this relies on the unique status of the dollar. If that status diminishes, the entire framework of United States influence begins to falter. Now, let me address another argument I frequently encounter. People claim that China has its own issues, its real estate market is under pressure, its population is aging, its economic growth is slowing. They argue that China cannot truly rival the United States. While this assessment is accurate, China certainly faces significant structural challenges. However, this is not about whether China is perfect or if it will replace the United States. This is about the world no longer wanting to confine all its resources within the dollar framework. It is about diversification. It is about having alternatives. For the first time in 50 years, countries possess real choices regarding where to store their savings, which currency to employ for trade, and how to protect themselves from financial upheaval. And they are exercising those choices. Consider the expansion of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These nations now represent a larger share of the global economy than the Group of Seven. They are actively discussing the formation of a shared trading currency among themselves. They are establishing development banks that compete with Western-run institutions, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Saudi Arabia, the key United States ally in the Middle East for many years, is contemplating joining BRICS and is considering selling oil in yuan. A decade ago, such a notion would have seemed improbable. The petrodollar arrangement, where oil is exclusively traded in dollars, has been a crucial pillar supporting dollar dominance. If major oil exporters begin to accept other currencies, that support weakens. Moreover, it is not just BRICS. Countries worldwide are entering into direct exchange agreements to trade in their local currencies. Argentina and Brazil are trading in their own currencies. India and Russia are transacting in rupees and rubles. China and Saudi Arabia are negotiating trade in yuan. Each of these arrangements may be modest on its own, but together they represent a significant shift away from dollar-based commerce. Moreover, central banks are clearly showing their preferences through their actions. Data from the International Monetary Fund indicates that the dollar's share of global reserves has declined from over 70% 2 decades ago to around 58% today. That constitutes a substantial decrease. Additionally, as mentioned earlier, gold is being accumulated at unprecedented levels, with central banks purchasing more than 1,000 tons of gold last year alone. They are reallocating wealth away from dollar-denominated assets into tangible assets that cannot be easily frozen or restricted. Thus, the pressing question for the United States is this: how do you maintain the dollar's unique position when the world is becoming less willing to accept it? This is where the options become limited and perilous. The first option is that the United States embraces a multipolar currency landscape where the dollar remains relevant but no longer holds a dominant position. This would require a degree of humility. It would necessitate reforming international financial institutions to give developing nations a stronger voice. It would involve accepting limits on United States authority based on historical realities and current geopolitics. This seems highly improbable, as United States leaders are not inclined to relinquish this advantage voluntarily. The second option is that the United States seeks to compel the world to continue using the dollar through increased pressure. This could involve imposing more sanctions, applying greater pressure on allies, or even taking direct actions to control strategic resources or trade routes. This is a risky endeavor, as it transforms an economic shift into potential global conflict. Given recent experiences in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, this is a decision that American leaders might seriously contemplate. The third option is for the United States to persist along its current trajectory, generating more money to address deficits, accumulating more debt, and eventually facing a fiscal crisis where the bond markets seize up, interest rates spike, and the economy plunges into a serious downturn. This represents the rough landing scenario, and each passing year without substantial reform increases its likelihood. The fourth option, which I believe to be the most likely, is a gradual fragmentation. The global system will split into currency blocks: a dollar bloc led by the United States and its closest allies, a yuan bloc centered around China and its trading partners, and potentially other regional groups as well. The world will become more unstable, uncertain, and prone to conflict. However, this will not result in a single, dramatic collapse, but rather a slow erosion of the previous order. This brings us back to China's decision to sell United States bonds. What China has done is not a one-time event, it is a signal. It serves as evidence that they have alternatives, that they are no longer confined to the dollar system, and that they can safeguard their national reserves from what they perceive